Hello, and welcome to this Wisdom of Boards seminar on grant making and how and where trustees can get involved. What I want to look at over the next 15 minutes or so is a little bit about the size of the grant making sector, the processes involved, how you can do better for grant making, and a few top tips as well. But first of all, let me give you a brief introduction to sector funding and trends and where grant making fits into that. This is overall the size of the grant making, the size of the overall income for the voluntary sector. You can see about half of that, £30 billion, comes from the public. About half a billion comes from the National Lottery. About 15 billion comes from government. About 5 billion comes from the voluntary sector. 5 billion comes from investments, and 2.4 from the private sector. And it's in that 5 billion from the voluntary sector, as most grant makers are also charitable trusts, are also registered charities, that's where it fits in. So that gives you a sense of the totality of where grant making fits into the wider picture. In terms of grant making, there are an estimated 8,000 grant makers in the UK. It's a bit of a hazy line as to exactly what is a grant maker and what isn't a grant maker, but that's roughly the figure we're looking at. And they're awarding something in the region of £3 billion annually. The top 2,500 grant makers give about 2.65 billion, or 88% of the total spend. So in other words, you get very much the sort of 80-20 rule in which a portion of the grant makers are giving the bulk of the money, which probably isn't surprising. Grant making is aimed at a number of sectors in particular. Education and training is about a quarter of it. Health is about 11%, arts, culture about 11%, welfare 9%, and so on. And that's down to an analysis of 16,500 grants. And the funds actually come from a variety of places. Some of them are endowments, in some cases going back hundreds of years. Some of them are company profits, some of them are fundraising, are fundraised, and some of them are about people's personal wealth having been put into a trust. Now, what are the pros and cons of grant making as a source of income? Well, one of the main advantages is one of the few ways that a small charity can get large-ish chunks of money relatively easily. The risks and returns of grant making are relatively easy to work out. You have a 1 in 10 a success rate in applications. You can say, okay, we put in this amount, we're likely to get this amount back. Doesn't always work, of course, but it does give you a better kind of prospect of return than some forms of fundraising. And it's also relatively quick. Compare that to, say, legacies, which you may get money, but you may get it in 10 years' time. Grant makers often prefer small charities. They often like the notion of a little charity in a particular area. And indeed, some of their statutes may be for geography-specific areas and funders. And there are relatively low costs as well to making that grant making. Somebody needs to spend the time, but you don't need to put large amounts of money up front that you might need to do, say, for an event to organize it all, etc. There are, of course, disadvantages as well. It's easy to have a terrible success rate. You can put in all those applications and not get the money back because there is a knack to it. And if you don't have that knack, it means you don't have success. And that knack can be quite easy for some people to get right and quite difficult for some people to get right. But it may be that you think you're not the right kind of charity, but you just aren't saying the right kind of things. It also needs to be somebody's role. It's very difficult to have everybody trying their hand at grant making. It's something that people need to understand the processes and the practices and how it all works. Another disadvantage is that grant makers often say they all applications welcome, and indeed their mem and arts, their legal standing may say we get everything, but they actually specify particular things they like to spend on money. It's always important to look at where they actually spend their money as well as what they legally say. And often grants need to be project specific. They want to give to a particular thing. They don't want to give to the general funds of the charity. What would charities like more of? What are some of the things that people say they would like to change about the way grant making happens? This is from IVAR, the Institute of Voluntary Action Research. They would like to offer chance to ask questions before they make an application. They'd like a two-stage application. If you put in a relatively small amount, you can then be sure it's on the right lines before you have to put a lot of money in, a lot of time in, I should say. Then you want a clear success rate so people know how likely they are to get it. We'll see some idea of that in a moment. You don't ask as a grant maker for detailed information until there's a good chance of success. You give meaningful feedback to people whose applications are turned down. Multi-year funding is appreciated, and you allowed grantees to adapt and change plans and budgets as needed when their circumstances change. People grant are always preferred to be unrestricted because of the changing world and because of the difficulties of not getting core funding. And you should only ask for information that you need and will use. And that gives you an idea of the kinds of things that charities have said over the years that they would like to see done better. Here's a sample for grant approvals, and I show this in order to give you an idea of the kinds of way that some of the larger grant makers work. It may be slightly out of date, but the specifics aren't as important as the general notion of how it all works. This first one is for the Henry Smith charity. So what you start off with is somebody taking an eligibility test. If they pass that, they go to the online application that's reviewed by the grants team. They may request more information. They make a decision within 6 weeks. And then if that's right, you go on to stage 2, in which you have more information. There will be an assessment visit, which is quite unusual for grant makers. There's a decision at a quarterly trustee meeting about what's working. And it's usually about 5 months from stage 1 to get to the stage 2 decision. And you get that decision. And if it's unsuccessful, you give a reason. To give you an idea, in 2021, Henry Smith had 955 applications. 80 didn't meet the eligibility, 9 withdrew, 91% of applicants were assessed, 32% got to stage 2, and 91% of stage 2 applications were successful. So what that shows you is indicative here. If you get through to stage 2, you have a pretty good chance of success. In other words, those 2 pages or whatever it is for the Henry Smith for the stage 1 are really important. The detail in stage 2 is filling out, but the most bulk of people don't go through to the next stage if they are at the stage 1. So that's the place where you put your time and energy into. This is Paul Hamlyn Foundation, gives you a similar kind of idea of the process. You have an applicant deciding to look at the strategic priorities and take an eligibility. They have some funding streams. They do an online application. In this case, you get it back within 3 weeks. Some funds require a second stage, and you'll get a process. And they had a total of 1,800 applications asking for 70 million, and they made final decisions on nearly 1,500 applications. That gives you an idea of the process overall. Where do people find out about grant makers? Perhaps the most single useful bit of information I can give you. Some key sources is Google. Do use Google to find out who is doing the kind of things in the area that you're working in. Other organizations' annual reports is it typical. You have other people working in your sector. Look to see who they thank in their annual report, because that gives you an indication of some of the people that might be funding in your area. You can also get money from the Charity Commission or the Oscar Register to see who it is that you're likely to be able to get money from, whether it's in England or Wales and Scotland. And of course, you have the Charity Commission in Northern Ireland too. The Director of Social Change has its Director of Grant Making Trusts. That gives a pretty comprehensive look at it. It's an online tool as well as a printed tool too. You also have UK Grant Making, and you've got the website addresses for all of these there. 360 Giving gives an idea of how some of the different organizations, what they fund and so on. And then the Charity Excellence Framework as well is quite a good source of information and has a regular feature with new UK charitable trusts and foundations. And then for those of you in a specific area, the landfill tax funders are those organizations with the money set up by the landfill tax, where they pay to dump money, and 10 miles of a landfill, you can get it. And if you are within 10 miles, it can be really quite a good high chance of response. So what are some of the top tips for grant making success? Well, first one I would say is research your grant makers before applying. Know their priorities and their application processes. We've seen how Paul Hamlyn had his different strategic priorities, and we can see overall that the more you understand about what it is people look at, the more you can tailor it to make sure you say. It's like those essays you used to do at school, where people want you to show that you can answer the question you're put. The question grant makers are putting is, why should we give you the money compared to anyone else? Also, the second part of researching them is understand which bits of the process matter most. Don't think the 2-pager isn't that important when it may be the most single important bit of the process. See where your peer organization gets grants from. We've already talked doing that in the annual report. And I would always prioritize quality of an application, spending more time on an application over quantity. The spray and pray type of approach doesn't particularly do well with grant making. Be really wary in today's world of using AI, one of the tools, because if you're a grant maker, the last thing you want to use AI for is to sit there and have hundreds of identical applications using identical tone of voice, because they're all written with some kind of artificial intelligence tool. And there are much better uses for charities than AI. Prepare your set pieces, stuff about you, your financial situation, the impacts that you have, and so on, and get them right, because you should be able to slot them with some adaptation into lots of different situations. And then also identify a grant maker's hot buttons. What is it based on their grant criteria they're looking for? What kind of words and phrases do you think are important to them? What is it they're wanting to see? Do they talk strongly about impact? Do they talk strongly about communities or whatever else it is? Understand the kind of things that may be the ways that you can get to their grant making success. So that's it from me. I hope that's been useful, this whiz through the world of grant making, and I look forward to talking to you the next time we do a Wisdom of Boards session. So thanks very much. I'm Joe Saxton, and I hope you found this useful.